For our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Calling to order the Planning Commission Advisory Committee for the regular meeting of Monday, February 12th, 2018. Sue, roll call, please.
Commissioner Cadwalder.
Here.
Commissioner Chambers.
Here.
Commissioner Plank.
Here.
Commissioner Schraven. Here. And Chair Barker.
Here. Thank you. Do I have a motion for approval of the agenda?
Motion to approve it. I'll second.
And any discussion? All in favor of approving the agenda as it stands, please say aye.
Aye.
Agenda is set. Do I have a motion for the approval of the minutes of the previous meetings? And there is a regular meeting and two public hearings. Let's do public hearing ordinance 1801 first.
Motion to approve it.
And support.
Second.
And discussion. All in favor of accepting 1801, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion stands. And do I have a motion for the public hearing ordinance 1802?
Anybody else want to? I'll make motion to accept it. Yeah.
Okay. And any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
That motion is accepted then. And do I have a motion for the regular meeting of January 8th?
Motion to approve. Second.
Any discussion, please? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All of the minutes have been accepted and approved. Thank you. Any public comments at this point?
I'm here about Greg Canfield, 306 Elm Street, and I'm not sure, you're going to talk about the stuff, the zoning that was kicked back from the
Correct.
council, so
Correct.
I'll address that then. Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry for being late.
thank you.
No.
Old business, zoning ordinance text amendments. And Andy, you want to kind of lead us through here? Evidently, there is a concern that the city council had.
Yes, at the previous council meeting, well, let me back up a little bit. So in January, we held public hearings on short-term rentals and on chapter 22, which is administration and enforcement. Both of these things are recommended to council. They reviewed them at the previous council meeting, the first one in February. And my understanding was there was a little bit of concern regarding the language, specifically in section 2202, subsection C, dealing with zoning compliance permits. And, you know, I think, and Greg, I know you were kind of one of the ones questioning this. And so some of the discussion was, well, if someone is doing work inside a building or in a basement or in some capacity that doesn't affect anything on the outside, why do we need a zoning compliance permit? So my understanding is that council they haven't sent this back to you, but they did table it, and they just kind of had some concerns. I'm going to attend the next council meeting to go over this with them, along with some other things. And so I asked this be put back on the agenda just to kind of have some discussion amongst the planning commission as far as if you feel like this process in here is sufficient, or if you think that maybe it's, you know, I think some of the comments from council was that it was maybe a little heavy-handed or more so than necessary. And if that's the case, we can look at it and rework it a little bit. But that's kind of the gist of the concerns as I understand it. And so that's where we are. And so I guess I just wanted to open it up for discussion amongst the planning commission and just kind of have some informal conversation with you guys to see if,
Sure.
you know, how I should go about making changes and if I should make them.
And Greg, you want to amplify on that? So-
Yeah, I can just address that a little bit. I purchased a house over near Rutgers Funeral Home, and it has a finished basement, and I want to just partition off and put a little office in part of that. And because I'm in the public eye and on city council. Most people wouldn't pull a building permit for that, but I went in and pulled a building permit for that, and they said, hey, we need a site plan. And I've lived here 58 of my 60 years, and times are changing, I understand that, but we're kind of losing our local control over things. Cascade Township does our enforcement of building inspections and stuff, and they have a pretty narrow view of what needs a permit. Lori Gerard that works downstairs, they built their house 15 years ago, and the railings were getting weak, and they wanted to put the exact same railings back up, replace the rotted wood with the same thing, and Cascade told her she needed a building permit for that. And that's a simple repair, and it's all about revenue, and it's just, we're getting to where I think, I'm not a fan of big government, but what could possibly, why would I need a site plan to put a wall up in a basement? There's nothing outside that's being affected by that.
Andy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the reason why we have zoning compliance permits and why we require this process of basically everything is because Cascade does the city's building inspection, the city needs a paper trail that starts here that we can review what's going on. And on top of that, because zoning deals a lot, it's not just with what goes on the outside, although that's a big part of it. Zoning also looks at how property is used, not just if it meets a setback or if it's, if it's too tall or something like that. So there could be instances, and there are instances where the use of a building changes, which can have significant implications on the rest of the neighborhood. If something goes is changed from a low intensity office activity to a very high intensity, I don't know, like a more intense retail or industrial activity or something like that, that's going to have significant implications on parking and potentially noise and things like that that go on within the neighborhood. So with pretty much everything, we require a zoning compliance permit. Now, when Greg had to submit a site plan, that doesn't mean that it has to come here in front of the planning commission. Most new single-family homes, new duplexes, home occupations, interior stuff, porches, signs, the fairly modest, minimal improvements and changes are things that require a zoning compliance permit, which is you fill out a form, the fee is $25. And then we look at it to make sure that if there are any zoning implications, that it still satisfies the ordinance. It also notifies the assessor that there's a change going on to the property that may or may not affect what they have to do. And we deal with all that stuff internally behind the scenes. That's not something that has to come out in front of the planning commission. You guys don't have to approve anything. We just approve it because the ordinance lets us approve things like that. And then we can move on. So I understand what you're saying, and I guess my interpretation of this is not that, in my view, I don't think the city is trying to, overreach or control too much. I do get the concern, and I do agree that it seems kind of silly at times that you have to ask for zoning approval to do something that really doesn't affect anything at all. But there is as far as I'm concerned, I think there is a reason for it, and primarily that has to do with just making sure that how the property is going to be used going forward is still compatible with what the zoning is going to be. There are lots of things you could do inside of a dwelling that we would want to know about. For example, if someone wants to, and this is an extreme example, so bear with me, but if someone decides they want to use their basement to grow marijuana plants, we're going to want to know about that. And it could be that the only way that we might know about that is if they come in and pull a building permit and pull the proper electrical permits, turn in a site plan zoning that we can all look at and figure this stuff out. That's an extreme example, obviously, in what Greg was doing and the partition and having an office down there. We have no problem with that. We approved it, and we told him that he could go ahead and deal with Cascade. We signed off on it because it's no problem. It's what would have happened anyways. But I guess, to me, I think there is there is value in having the process start here and having it work internally through city staff, not just me, but also Sue and the assessor. And then once everyone's comfortable that it satisfies any requirements, as far as I'm concerned, I just look at the zoning ordinance. I don't, look beyond that as far as I'm concerned. But if it satisfies the zoning ordinance, we sign off on it, it goes over to Cascade, and then all of the building stuff they deal with. So if there's a building permit needed and deck rails need to be a certain distance apart and all that kind of thing, that's not something that we have control over as a planning commission or as a planner.
Right, this is a residential building permit in a residential zoning, nothing's changing. And I understand when things change, but it's just, we're creating a bureaucracy here where, now, like Pink Arrow has to pay $25 to have a permit, and I understand there's a cost to administration, but we're creating such a bureaucracy that it's really changing the flavor of our small town, and government is running our lives. But I will withdraw my building permit, and that's fine. People want to fix things up, and you hold it back. Cascade is pretty heavy on enforcement, and I don't know if they're driving part of this, that we have to meet their requirements.
Yeah, who's requiring the site plan?
Well, according to Sue, there's something else that I still need today. I have a $25.
And that's the zoning application that you would submit with your drawing of the basement and the room that you want to create.
Like
It could be like a hand-drawn
A
thing.
hand-drawn, yes, yep.
Right, but why do I need a zoning permit for a building?
Well, that's.
I mean, I understand the building permit needs that drawing.
Yep. As far as zoning application, I mean, any project that is done in the city, we've used this zoning application. It doesn't necessarily pertain to zoning. Maybe we need to come up with a different application, but that is what we've used right along. Even as far as re-roofing or re-siding a house, you need to go through that same process as well.
Should that be part of the building permit on one form instead of two? Why do we need two forms?
Well, the building permit is specifically geared towards Cascade with our name on it as well. That's their form.
So is there another charge for that or not?
Building permit, then Cascade turns around and they would charge whatever is necessary for that building permit, and that's based upon
The value of the
the
project.
value of the project,
Yeah.
yeah.
The other reason why there's two forms too is because Cascade is administering a separate set of rules from the ones that we have. I mean, they're administering the building code. We're not. None of this, the zoning ordinance doesn't have, much in the way of building standards in it. We don't get into foundations and what kind of wall and insulation and roof materials, and we have nothing to do with any of that. So that's also part of the reason why there's separate applications, is because there's separate codes.
And if you were to break this out between commercial, say, and residential, and you allowed certain things in the residential area to not have to apply for a permit, you would have to list those, correct? I mean, we would have to come up with a whole new ordinance, is that?
Well, if you wanted to do something like that, we could add some exemptions in the zoning compliance permit. We just have to be very careful that we write those fairly narrowly, I would suggest, because we don't want to, allow more than what you're comfortable allowing without any kind of local control or oversight at all. I mean, I don't think the intent of any of this is to make anyone's life difficult or, to create more government than we need. But I think the intent here is that we want to make sure that that all of the projects are, that we're considering all of the city's rules, that we're treating everyone consistently and fairly in order. And the $25 is basically what it would take to just administer
Those projects?
the rules. Yeah, I mean, it's not,
Right.
I don't think it's something that, generates a lot of revenue.
Any other?
And also something that makes sure they're building it halfway right.
That's what the building permit in the building inspection process is for, so yeah, so it's built up to code. I mean,
Yeah.
the building codes are there, so we build structures that are safe for people to live in, and everyone knows that. So, yeah, that's why Cascade comes out and inspects, and building inspectors inspect everything from foundations to framing to electrical and plumbing and all that stuff, because it obviously has to be safe and installed properly and built properly.
And again, the question, at least it appears to me as though the question is that there are some projects in the interior of somebody's house that really don't make a whole lot of sense, that you need to get a permit for.
Yeah, we do have some.
And that's questionable. I mean,
Yeah.
and, you know, how is that decided? Or is it not decided? It's just simply anything you do, basically, you have to get a permit.
As far as the building code stuff goes, I don't know what specifically triggers a requirement from Cascade as to what does versus does not need a permit. Like, I know typically under the Michigan Building Code, I think if you're gonna have like a shed in your backyard, if it's under 200 square feet, you typically don't need a building permit. You still need a zoning compliance permit because we want to make sure you're putting it in the right spot and on your property and all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't need a building permit. And so there are probably other projects within a house that also don't require building permits.
Small decks, and there are some simple things. It's just,
Right.
my concern is we're adding a whole nother layer and complicating things. And you're great at your job, and I understand that, but sometimes these groups come in and tell us how to do things, and they're just creating their own jobs. That helps continue that. And I just don't see how residentially, in a residential zoning, that you're in compliance with what you're doing. But I just wanted to voice my concerns, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other thoughts on this?
I mean, it's hard enough even building your own house and stuff, yeah. Get into remodeling and get a permit after permit after permit.
Right. I mean, I guess I sympathize with the idea that there are home repairers that necessarily should not need a permit. But I sympathize with the city position, and our position, that if you start eliminating some of those, where do you draw the line? And who draws that line? I mean, obviously, we would have to draw that line, but the point of the matter is that who makes those decisions as to how many permits do you need and things of that nature? That to me would be an exceptionally hard decision to make. I mean, you would have to see a list of projects that have gone on and pick and
Anything
choose.
structurally.
Right, yeah. I mean, you know, it just seems, you know, awkward, I guess, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, the last thing I would add is that this isn't, this section in here is new that talks about zoning compliance. This isn't, it's new language in here, but it's not, it doesn't change what we've been doing for, you know, many years. I mean, this has been the process for, I mean, as long as I've been here, which, I don't know, maybe 5 years now. And it's always the way that we've worked on things, and zoning is kind of the first step in the process. So when someone comes here for anything, whether they're building a brand new building or they're doing something much smaller, the first place they go is City Hall, and they talk to Sue or whoever and get the forms they need, and then they move forward from there. So we could write some exemptions in here, or some possible exemptions, or language that would prevent or, you know, eliminate the need for a zoning permit in certain instances. But my concern would be that I would want to make sure that we do it fairly, so we're not, you know, I wouldn't want to give the zoning enforcement officer or the planner or anybody else the, you know, for lack of a better word, the burden of deciding who needs a permit.
Yeah.
It's gotta be,
It's either.
it's gotta be a transparent process in the ordinance, so
Right.
whoever administers it just does kind of what it says.
I'm leaning that way myself at this point, at least. I haven't seen enough really evidence to say that it's onerous. It just strikes me as though that there certainly could be a reason to put in some exemptions, but at this point, I don't see us doing that, myself.
So can someone point me to the language that is creating the specific, the bit of language that changed in the last 5 years that makes it?
So it's section in the version, it's chapter 22, administration of enforcement, 2202 permits, 2202 subsection C, it's on page 2, zoning compliance permits. Subsection 1 says, no permit or approval shall be issued for any use, building, construction, work, alteration, addition, or improvement to land or land division until a zoning compliance permit has been issued by the zoning enforcement officer under the terms and provisions of this ordinance. And I think, Greg, your critique here as well, any use of building, construction, work, alteration, addition, or improvement is pretty broad. If I'm paraphrasing, I think what your concern is. So, I mean, it's a question, well, geez, if I want to paint my bedroom, does that mean I gotta come in here and?
That's my.
I mean, no, it's not, but.
I'm putting a $200 wall up, and it's pretty simple
Yeah.
stuff.
So,
Yeah, you're helping the structure.
yeah,
Well, I'm improving a property, which, you know, Lowell is
Yeah.
improving. We want to encourage people to fix up their property.
right.
And you
But
don't want
it's very tough, I agree. How do you set a, below $1,000, you don't need this if it's minor enough, but it's a difficult thing to establish a threshold at which it.
Exactly, and how does that change next year? I mean, or 2 years from now, when, maybe inflation picks up or something like that, and then you're right back to the same situation. And is it $200 if a contractor does it, or $400 if I do it, because I gotta go back to the store 12 times? I mean, it makes a difference, I think, in the long term. This at least follows a pattern. It gives our people a chance to look at it. You would think that at some point common sense comes into it, and I don't know how you can't necessarily put common sense into a law. You have to make the law and then enforce it, and enforce it to the best of your ability.
Right, and because I had some concerns at the council meeting, I just felt I owed it to you guys to show up and explain myself.
No, that's fine.
Didn't
Thank you.
really
We
expect
appreciate
a
it.
total reversal here.
Yeah, no, we appreciate you coming in, because it's something that affects a lot of citizens. I guess my other question is how many citizens know you really have to do this? You're in the
I was
business.
gonna say, it's a self-selecting
Exactly.
bunch of people who are gonna be flagellating themselves by going in and admitting they wanna put in a $200 wall.
Yeah. I mean, there will be instances where people, I mean, I'm sure it happens all the time where people do stuff without a building permit. Maybe they need it, maybe they don't. We do know that if Cascade gets an application for anything, if it isn't accompanied with an approved permit from this office, they'll send it right back here.
Right.
And say, we're not touching this until you guys look at it and sign off on it.
Which is what we want them to do.
Yeah.
I mean, that only makes sense. And if they are our building code standard bearers and enforcers, then we need to follow the building code that they follow.
Mhm.
Correct? Okay. Any other questions?
I sympathize with Greg. I'm kind of in the same boat with Greg on this. Sitting on council, you're supposed to do the right thing. When we tried, as Greg did, you could very well he could have easily built that wall down there.
Correct.
And then what's the repercussions, if somebody says, well, why did he get away with it? I'm assuming this has always been where you had to submit a drawing, whether you sit right there that second on a scrap piece of paper, draw it out, show them. That's always been in the ordinance, correct? This isn't something we just had.
Well, this stuff, the process that we've done all this in the past has not changed. I don't, in there before though, there was not any language that specifically enabled or specify what the process is for zoning compliance permits.
You're changing the ordinance to follow your policy of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
yeah, kind of. I mean, it's not,
Bringing it up to date.
it's not my favorite thing in the world to do, but yeah, in this case, it's in here because we already do it. Most communities have a permitting language in here. Not everyone has zoning permits at all. They just go get a building permit. Like if they get a site plan approval, there's no step after that with getting a zoning approval. It's just, okay, now I'm done with that. Now I go get a building permit. I don't get a zoning permit. And if someone wants to build a house, they just go get a building permit and they don't bother with any of this stuff. It's possible to do it that way, but because we have zoning enforcement staff and because we've been doing this way for a long time and it's worked out quite well, I felt it made sense to put this language in here to like Greg said, to codify what we're going to do.
Bring it up to date, and
Yeah.
also that's part of the zoning enabling act, correct? Is that part of this, bringing it up to date? I mean, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the entire process is, to help, bring it more in line with what the act enables and requires. Sure.
Anybody want to make any motions to change things or to leave it as is?
Could you put anything in there for, like, just doing structural work? Or the integrity of the house is in jeopardy or getting a permit then?
Or can we do like a dollar amount?
I'd have to do some research on that.
Could you?
We do have language in our non-conforming chapter, for example, that says, any kind of, changes to, made to bring something, to make it structurally safe is going to be permitted, whether it's non-conforming or not. So we could add language like that in here. We also have language in our site plan review chapter that talks about when a site plan is needed and when a site plan is not needed, or when site plan approval by the planning commission is needed, when the site plan is only approved by the zoning enforcement officer, when you're changing something, who approves the change. So there's similar language that addresses some of this stuff in that chapter too, but none of it appears to eliminate the requirement for a permit at all. It just says, well, the zoning enforcement officer can approve it instead of the planning commission. So I can research and see if there are some examples or exemptions from
I don't think, Andy,
permits.
Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's getting the permit that was the issue. We all know we have to get permits for different things. I think it was, and I found it quite silly, that he had to submit a site plan for a wall, which in theory, this code, if I have a wall in my basement and I have to replace a sheet and a half of the drywall, in theory, I have to pull a permit, I have to give them a site plan and to move forward.
The site plan was withdrawn after I questioned it, though. I will say that, but not everybody questions it.
But that's,
But it is, right.
Right.
How
So,
far we chase
and-
this.
Let's do this then, Andy. Why don't you draw up some possible suggestions here? I like Dave's idea of whenever you're dealing with structure, it's a no-brainer. You have to do it.
Yeah.
You have to pull it.
You're wrecking the integrity of the house somehow or another.
Correct. Yeah.
And there's still a building permit.
Right.
So they're-
Right. Yeah, and it seems to me as though that would make some sense, and as much as I'm against the dollar figure, it's probably a good thing to do in your review, and then we can talk about it at least. Put in a dollar figure, whatever you think is
Okay.
appropriate there.
So, just so you guys know, so this is still going to be on council's agenda next Tuesday.
right.
So,
And you can bring these suggestions to council.
Okay.
And if council wants to make the changes, our recommendation at this point, this stands. I mean, we haven't changed ours. They haven't formally asked us to change it.
right.
So you can present those to them, and if they want to make a change to it, they have that right, they can change it.
Right.
And then adopt it. I mean, that's up to them.
That answers my question.
I mean, our thinking is that we have brought the issue there, and I think that the idea of any changes to a structure, you have to, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it seems to me as though it does become common sense, and if we have to say common sense costs $1,000 or $500 or whatever, maybe that's what we have to do. I don't know. I mean, that may be the easiest way of doing it, but certainly bring it before council and we'll give them several options and let them discuss it.
Okay. Bruce, will you be here on the 20th then for council?
I can be,
Can
yes.
you be?
Yes,
Thank you.
yeah. I think that's the better way of going at this point. Commissioners?
I like that way.
Okay, all right. We're sold on that.
All right.
Thanks, Greg.
No, thank you, and thanks for all your hard work. You guys are the experts at this, and then we get backseat drivers like me to come in, want to change it.
That's fine. That's why we hold open hearings too. That's the whole idea of doing it. Okay, now, did we have anything under zoning ordinance text amendments beyond that? I mean, that was it, correct? So all of the ordinance, that just 1801 and 02,
Yeah, as I
public
understand,
hearing that we
Yeah, the
approved?
Airbnb was okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't have a problem.
No concerns there.
was that one approved or did
Was
you
it-
table?
was it
it?
approved?
I think we tabled everything.
We tabled it all just to get it back to clear, to get this cleared up and then bring it forward. They came to us as a package
Okay,
and we'd like to approve them as a package.
okay.
So that's why we kicked them back and do the relook at it.
So all three then will go back. The Airbnb, the public hearing on ordinance 1801 and 1802,
Yes.
correct?
Well, there was just the two amendments. There was, I think there was,
We did.
yeah, there was the short-term rentals and this whole chapter here. So there was two ordinances. One was ordinance 1801,
Right,
one was ordinance 1802. So both of those were tabled.
right.
This was the only issue that needed to be addressed, and we'll address it with them on the 20th, and then
Okay.
hopefully
Okay, so
have some consensus.
we're current with all our zoning ordinances at this
So,
point that we
yep.
have been-
Yep, except for what's under new business.
Any other questions on that? Okay, let's go to new business then, chapter 19, parking. Thank you.
So provided in your packets was a short memo from me dated February 9th, along with a red line chapter of chapter 19 of your zoning ordinance, which is off-street parking and loading. And so we have suggested a handful of changes to this section here, which I want to go over with you. The major changes are discussed in this cover memo. A few of these have been kind of, I mean, this was before most of you guys started on the planning commission, but there were a few things here that I wanted to go over with you. And so I think what I'll do is kind of walk through the changes in the chapter, and then when we get to some of the stuff that I want to specifically talk about, we'll stop there. So on the first page, section 19.02, the subsection B, most of this language is already in there, and I just found it confusing to read. And so what we're doing here is saying that if you're in the C2 or MU district, so downtown basically, if you are there, you can count public parking, either on-street or off-street public parking. You can count that towards your required parking minimum. So because a lot of these lots are very small, they're 100% occupied by a building, obviously it doesn't make any sense to try to require everyone to fit parking on their same parcel, because it's going to be completely impossible in a lot of cases. But the city has a number of public parking lots. There's the one on South Monroe. There's one over here behind City Hall. There's lots of on-street parking, and so we're saying that you can count that towards your requirement if you're in those two districts. If you're not, you can still You can also provide parking on a separate parcel, but it has to be within 400 feet of your site. So there are a few places in town where there's one business, say, takes up the entire block and their parking is across the street, for example. So it addresses situations like that. Typically, out further on West Main, all of those parking spaces are always going to be located on the same parcel because they're bigger parcels. But when you get downtown and into the more traditional grid pattern neighborhoods of Lowell, that can be a bit tricky. So this subsection B, again, this isn't anything new, but it's clarifying what is already in there. Section 19.03, subsection B, I've not proposed any changes here. This section requires that parking lots be paved with asphalt, cement, or quote, such surfaces approved by the planning commission. There was discussion, gosh, probably a couple of years ago now over what exactly that should be. We temporarily allowed for some like asphalt millings on the South Bend Road parking lot prior to it being surfaced, just to kind of get through the winter one year. There's been a question of, well, would you allow gravel? Would you allow someone to do like an asphalt millings as a permanent parking surface? Would you ever allow gravel or, you know, some kind of permeable pavement and things like that? I've not proposed any changes in here. I think what's in here is sufficient, but I wanted to bring that to your attention and see if there's anything that you want to encourage or prohibit.
Commissioners, anything stand out? We have the ability to approve anything that we feel is correct anyway,
Yeah,
according to that.
yeah, and that's why I didn't,
So like permeable bricks, which obviously are
Yeah.
probably a good thing, but
yeah, or there could be areas where, you know, there's some part of a parcel that doesn't get used very much, and so you say, well, do we really want to make them pave
right.
all this land for only a temporary or infrequent use? So there are some instances where gravel or some less durable material would be permitted.
Can we put a list together of acceptable materials, like asphalt millings, crushed concrete, certain gravels? Because not all gravels really work well in parking. You know, the clay mix has to be right, and
Right.
that way you know that.
Yeah, we can do that.
And then that way, then it's in here that if somebody says, well, I want to put,
Driveway with sand?
you can, but, you know, fill in the back of our parking, and we'd like to use crushed concrete or millings, and, you know, because we're never going to hardly use it, and then that way, then they know exactly what they can and can't use.
Mhm. Yeah, we can do that.
And I'd kind of like to see that in there.
Moving forward here, section 1903D. Again, I've not proposed any changes here, but this section, we've run into this a few times, and this section troubles me a little bit. So it says, when a required non-residential parking lot is situated on a parcel which adjoins a residential district, either abutting directly or across a street, the respective parking area shall be set back a minimum of 20 feet, excluding parking or drives, from any lot line, unless a greater setback is required by any provision of this ordinance. So I remember there have been a few instances where we've kind of scratched our head at this provision, specifically with a couple of the churches in town, where they basically have their churches on one parcel, and then next to it they use an entire separate parcel or block in some cases for parking. And then if you apply a 20-foot setback to all of the parcel lines to that parking lot, plus the islands that are required, one for 20 feet, you're taking out like, I don't know, 40% of their parking in some cases. in some of the smaller city blocks, 20 feet is a lot of space. And so that's something I get it, and I don't, ideally, yeah, that would be great to have a setback and a green belt and trees and so forth, but at some of these small lots, it's tough to fit that in there. So my suggestion would be to consider maybe a smaller number, or allow for planning commission or staff to modify that in certain instances where it's
Could they get a
necessary.
variance if they needed it?
Well, yeah, and that's what the city had to do for the South Bend Road parking lot. But if we're creating an instance where we just make everyone come in and get a variance, I'd rather just adjust the rules now so they don't have to do that.
Is there a setback that would work better, like a 7 foot, 8 foot, 10 foot?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to me, sure, I mean, we could do 10 feet and I would be fine with that. If you talk to the people who own the property, they're gonna say, I want no setback, because I want to be able to maximize every available square inch of parking on the site and use it for parking, and they're not gonna wanna put in any island, they're not gonna wanna put in any trees or landscaping, nothing. And I get it, I mean, I understand why they would want to do that, I don't necessarily agree, but, so, to answer your question, sure, we can put in a different number that would work, but I don't know if it's gonna work for everybody. I mean, some of them, specifically, churches are hard because it's so, they're empty for most of the time, except for on Sunday mornings and a few other times. But when they're full, they can be, out into the street and into the neighborhoods, and, people could potentially be, blocking fire hydrants or driveways or whatever else. They're not supposed to, as we know, but those things can become problems. And so one of the things that I think you need to be aware of is that if we're gonna have any setback in here that reduces what you can fit the off-street lot, and you're pushing it up, and you're pushing it somewhere else, right? You're pushing it into an on-street parking space. And how much of that then is gonna be acceptable before it starts causing a problem in the neighborhood, or you're causing a shortage somewhere else? I mean, I'm generally supportive of, flexibility in parking and being restrictive and not over parking, especially in parking lots, because, I think parking is really expensive to maintain and to own and everything else. And so I don't like having things get hung up on how many parking spaces you have or how many parking spaces you need, or if you have too many. I don't want that to be an issue that drives a good project away. But I do think that it has to be realistic, and I wonder if a 20-foot setback in a traditional grid pattern development off-street parking lot makes much sense, because you're losing a lot of space.
Well, two things strike me. One is that it is when a required non-residential. So you're already in a situation where it's not residential, so we're not looking at buffering and all of those kinds of situations. I think setting it back to 10 feet would certainly be a reasonable thing. And then again, if we want to go with that or approval by the planning commission statement, that kind of statement there, because when you're talking about the islands and things of that nature, when they come to us, we have the right to change those and do those kinds of things. All right. So, but we don't want just vast wastelands of asphalt sitting out there that's out there 6.5 days a week. And that doesn't make any sense either. We're trying to get away from that.
Right.
So my recommendation would be to say 10 feet. And if the situation comes up, we still get a chance to look at it, and we still get a chance to make changes.
I like that one.
Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, you're at a 0 setback.
Yeah.
Well, if somebody's going to come to us, though, they're going to
We're gonna get somebody wanting that.
They're going to say that.
Yeah.
And then, we have to make a decision at that point. But at 20 foot, it does seem a little onerous. I mean, they are losing a lot of space there, especially if it's on all four sides. If you did it 3 of the 4 sides, because you'd have one attachment to whatever place you're trying to park for. I mean, I can see no setback on that side, but to leave it this way at 10, all the way around, we can always make that decision of saying, hey, look, you know, it's attached to your building, we don't care. You can do whatever you want there, you know, rather than put a tree there or whatever. That makes more sense to me.
Okay.
We do also have some language in here in general provisions that we added that says that the zoning enforcement officer may waive the requirements of the landscaping section if it's determined that the landscaping would unreasonably reduce the number of spaces within the parking lot. So there is a little bit of flexibility built in.
So there's already wiggle room there.
Yeah.
I still think that moving that 20 to 10, let's see what it looks like at least.
Okay.
Fair enough, commissioners?
I just like to make a comment. It's awesome to hear you guys thinking and making these changes because right now Lowell is booming and times are good and the town is full, but we need to do everything we can to make this an attractive community to come to. And it's great, Andy, that you're finding ways to work with us because we need to help people that want to locate here and invest here. Just really refreshing to hear what you guys are saying. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Greg. All right.
Moving along here, on page 3 of the amendment here, you know, generally these are non-substantive changes. Under 1904D, additional parking shall be provided to maintain a proper ratio to increase any floor area or building use capacity or change of use. So again, if someone changes from a office that requires 10 spaces to a restaurant that requires 30 spaces, well, you gotta provide the extra 20 spaces.
That's a good catch.
Item G, again, this is fairly non-substantive. This last section here, on-street parking spaces shall not be counted toward the required parking for any use. Well, we just talked about allowing that to count in certain districts, so I just added unless authorized elsewhere in this ordinance, so we're not conflicting with what we do downtown. In subsection J, we allow for shared parking. And so what's typical in the zoning ordinance is that if you have a mixed-use building, or you have 2 uses on the same property, usually they're in the same building. You say, well, your parking is just going to be, you take the requirements of use A, you add them to use B, and that's how much parking you have to have. I don't like that necessarily because a lot of times uses overlap, and so you're guaranteeing that your parking lot is 50% empty all the time. And so I want to see less land spent on parking and more land used for buildings. And so we added the sentence at the end that says, however, for buildings or uses where peak parking demand does not overlap, the zoning enforcement officer or planning commission may authorize up to 50% reduction in the collective number of off-street parking spaces required by 1907. So, for example here, if there is a certain use, say an office or something, that their parking demand is really 8 to 5, and there's a different use, maybe it's a bar or even a residential use where their peak parking demand is really weekends and evenings, you can probably have a much smaller parking lot and accommodate everyone that needs to go there because people come and go and all that kind of thing. So this allows, at the discretion of you or the zoning enforcement officer, when they're the reviewing agency, to reduce the number of parking when they can demonstrate that, look, this is our shared parking arrangement, this is our demand. And, they have to provide